Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracking the incredible 7th century metamorphosis of a tiny, resource-starved island. How did Singapore roar from a swampy fishing village into a massive global superpower? Let's find out. Our story actually kicks off way back in 1299 with a mythic prince and a massive storm. Legend says he spotted a majestic beast. Thinking it was a lion, he dubbed the island Singapora. The place quickly exploded into a wealthy, bustling ancient trading hub for merchants all over the globe. Jump to 1819. Stamford Raffles arrives, totally transforming those quiet jungles into a chaotic, booming free port. Suddenly, it's a giant melting pot. Diverse global cultures and incredible goods were colliding daily on the docks. But then, 1942 hit. The lights went out and the so-called impregnable British fortress fell in days. Renamed Shonato, the island suffered through a dark, terrifying era of hunger and absolute silence. But here's the crazy part. That shared hardship forged an absolute, unbreakable resilience among the citizens. Fast forward to 1965. Singapore is thrust into sudden independence, facing a terrifying struggle for literal survival. The situation was incredibly dire. Get this, only 9% of citizens had proper housing back then. But they didn't panic. They immediately launched a relentless, high-speed strategy to house their massive population. Look at that leap. By 1989, those muddy swamps were completely transformed, sheltering 80% of locals. They literally built an army from scratch and industrialized whole swamps to secure jobs and economic survival. Today, the contrast is mind-blowing. It's a gorgeous digital ecosystem full of nature and those glowing super trees. This relentless visionary planning ensures Singapore never stops building on its futuristic, totally connected skyline. Singapore literally defied every single odd. So what impossible vision will the Lion City build next? Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracking how a tiny, resource-poor island literally roared its way into becoming a global superpower. We are going to cover centuries of history here, the massive triumphs, the heartbreaking tragedies, and the sheer brilliant engineering of a nation that honestly defied all the odds. It really begs the question, right? How exactly did a muddy swamp at the edge of a peninsula transform into one of the most advanced, high-tech nations on Earth? Well, to answer that, we've got to swap the modern world for the lush, moody greens of ancient Temesic, way back in the year 1299. Act 1. The Myth. Ancient Singapore. So our story kicks off in a swirling, iridescent storm. According to the Malay annals, a Srivajiayan prince named Sang Nila Utama was caught in this massive tempest and landed his wooden ship on a pristine, magical-looking beach. The legend goes that when he stepped off his boat and looked toward the dense jungle, he locked eyes with a glowing, magnificent beast, red body, black head, white chest. His chief minister called it a lion, or a singa. Now, look, historians will absolutely tell you it was probably a tiger, because lions just aren't native to the area. But the prince took it as a huge, auspicious sign and immediately renamed the settlement Singapora, which is Sanskrit for the Lion City. Founded in 1299, the Kingdom of Singapore definitely didn't just sit quietly. It spent the 14th century as this bustling, golden age gateway. We're talking merchants from China, India, and the Arab world all converging right there. They were trading exotic stuff like lacca wood for incense, tin and hornbill casks, and swapping them for Chinese porcelain and Indian cotton. It was a thriving hub. But, as history goes, it eventually fell to regional powers like the Javanese Majapahit or the Siamese by 1398. The last ruler had to flee, eventually setting up the Malacca Sultanate, and for a good while, the island kind of just faded into obscurity. Act 2. The Trading Port, the 1800s. Fast forward to 1819 and enter Sir Stamford Raffles and the British East India Company. The absolute strategic genius of Raffles was how he completely outmaneuvered the Dutch. See, the Dutch had strict monopolies in the region and taxed their ports heavily. Raffles bypassed all of that just by declaring Singapore a free port, zero import or export taxes. It was a massive disruption to the colonial status quo, and it basically acted like a magnet, instantly drawing massive global shipping traffic away from the Dutch and right to Singapore's docks. Because of that brilliant free port policy, the island exploded into this chaotic, incredibly diverse melting pot. Chinese, Indian, Malay, and British traders were all rubbing shoulders, trading in a massive global bazaar. We're talking spices, brilliant textiles, natural rubber, tin, porcelain, the whole shebang. And this boom went into absolute overdrive with ocean-going steamships and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. By cutting the travel time between Europe and East Asia so drastically, Singapore went from just a handy stopover to the absolute nerve center of Southeast Asian trade.
Act 3. The Dark Era, World War II.
The vibrant energy of the trading port drains into a pretty somber reality as we hit February 1942. During World War II, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell to the Japanese Imperial Army. Winston Churchill actually called it Britain's worst defeat. Singapore was renamed Shonan To, meaning Light of the South. But let's be clear, it was a period of profound terror. The Japanese military police initiated the tragic Sukching massacres, systematically targeting and executing tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese men who were perceived as anti-Japanese. Just an incredibly dark time. Survival literally became a daily, desperate struggle. To put that into perspective, just think about this number, $5,000. That was the cost of 100 caddies of rice by the end of the war, up from just $5. This massive hyperinflation, using the notorious banana money, illustrates the sudden, terrifying scarcity of basic needs. People were severely malnourished. Yet, amidst all this darkness and scarcity, something else happened. A really deep, localized resilience and shared community hardship was forged. They survived together, and it planted the seed that they could no longer rely entirely on the British for their protection. Act 4. The Build and Independence, the 1960s. All right, shifting gears. Following a really brief and pretty tumultuous merger with Malaysia, Singapore suddenly found itself completely independent on August 9, 1965. And they were extremely vulnerable, no natural resources, and a fractured population. Under Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the government took an aggressive, step-by-step approach to basically engineer survival. First up, 1960, they created the Housing and Development Board to clear out unhygienic slums. Then came the Land Acquisition Act, and finally the CPF Amendment in 68, which let citizens actually use their retirement savings to buy these new flats. It was brilliant. It created a property-owning democracy, literally giving a diverse immigrant population a physical, tangible stake in the ground they stood on, ensuring social stability. And that perfectly illustrates the state's major economic pivot during those make-or-break years. On one side of the coin, the government aggressively stepped in, setting up state-owned enterprises just to build the necessary infrastructure. On the flip side, they launched a massive export-oriented strategy. They were deliberately courting multinational corporations, companies from Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, bringing them in to rapidly industrialize the nation, train up the workforce in things like precision engineering, and literally plug Singapore directly into the global economic grid. But here's the thing. Economic survival means absolutely nothing without military security. In 1965, Singapore had, practically speaking, zero army, so they kicked off Project Starlight. They secretly brought in Israeli military advisors to build the Singapore armed forces totally from scratch. And here is a wild historical detail for you. To avoid inflaming any geopolitical friction with their Muslim-majority neighbors, these Israeli advisors were humorously disguised and referred to internally as Mexicans. It's just a perfect example of Singapore's hyper-pragmatic, whatever-it-takes approach to national survival. Act 5. Modern Smart Nation, Present Day. The transformation that followed under Prime Ministers Goh Chok Tong and Lee Hsien Loong has been nothing short of staggering. They relentlessly pushed the country up the value chain, creating a high-value, knowledge-based economy. They brought in the iconic Marina Bay Sands to supercharge global tourism. They launched the Smart Nation Initiative to completely wire the city for the digital age. And they introduced Skills Future simply because they recognized a hard truth. In a country with literally zero natural resources, the human mind is the only asset that actually matters. So, what will the next chapter of the Lion City's roar sound like in the digital age? The crucial point to take away from this explainer is that Singapore's survival was never, ever guaranteed. It wasn't some happy accident. It was meticulously engineered through sheer pragmatism, strict governance, and an unyielding community resilience. From a mystical jungle to a colonial free port, straight through the darkness of war to this glowing modern digital ecosystem we see today, Singapore proves that with enough vision, you can build a thriving nation out of thin air. all leave you to ponder how this incredible island will continue to adapt, innovate, and roar into tomorrow. Singapore sits directly at the crossroads of global maritime trade, a location that historically left the island exposed to volatile oceans and the ambitions of expansionist empires. In 1299, a Srivijayan prince named Sang Nila Utama landed on this island, then known as Temasek, after surviving a violent storm. According to local myth, he stepped onto the beach and spotted a magnificent beast with a red body and a black head. Believing it to be a lion, an auspicious sign, he claimed the land and renamed it Singapura, the Lion City. Singapore grew into a prosperous maritime kingdom in the 14th century, trading heavily with neighboring powers. But that accumulating wealth soon attracted invaders. By the 1400s, the kingdom was destroyed, its ruins eventually swallowed by the tropical jungle. The destruction of the ancient kingdom marked the end of Singapore's first era as a trade hub, leaving the island a silent jungle for the next 4 centuries. In 1819, the British arrived. Sir Stamford Raffles saw the island's deep natural harbor and established Singapore as a free port for the East India Company, eliminating taxes to aggressively attract merchants from every corner of the globe. The opening of the Suez Canal and the arrival of ocean-going steamships supercharged this strategy. By the 1880s, over 1.5 million tons of cargo passed through these waters annually. The quiet jungle island had become a massive, chaotic bazaar. Beneath the booming trade statistics, the population was deeply fractured. A wealthy elite of merchants oversaw thousands of transient laborers fleeing poverty in China and India. These laborers crowded into squalid, windowless tenements with zero sanitation, plagued by cholera and high-interest debt. The colonial administration kept these ethnic groups strictly separated to maintain control. This was an undeniable economic engine, but it lacked any shared identity. It was a trading post, operating under an illusion of stability, entirely reliant on the British Empire for protection. That illusion broke in 1942. The Japanese Imperial Army invaded, pushing rapidly down the Malayan Peninsula, capturing the British fortress in days. For the local population, seeing their colonial masters surrender was a profound psychological shock. The British protective shield vanished overnight. What followed were 3 years of starvation, forced labor, and fear under Japanese occupation. Cut off from global trade and facing daily brutality, the divided ethnic enclaves shared resources. Chinese, Malay, and Indian neighbors relied on one another simply to secure food and survive. The trauma of the war left an indelible mark on the island. It proved that external empires prioritize their own interests, planting the psychological seeds of self-reliance. Following the war, Singapore sought independence by merging with neighboring Malaya in 1963. But fierce racial politics and economic disputes tore the union apart. On August 9, 1965, the Malaysian parliament voted to expel Singapore from the Federation. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was left holding an independent state that few expected to survive. Singapore had no natural resources, not even enough water to sustain itself. It had 2 million people, a collapsing economy, and a location surrounded by hostile neighbors. Facing the literal threat of erasure, the government used this vulnerability as a catalyst. They turned the terrifying fear of total national collapse into a driving reason to completely and radically reinvent the state. The first priority was securing the borders. With only 2 infantry regiments under their control, Singapore brought in military advisors from Israel, another small state surrounded by larger neighbors, to build a national defense force and implement mandatory conscription. Internally, the crisis was just as severe. The population remained segregated by race, and 70% of citizens lived in unhygienic squatter settlements or overcrowded city slums. To solve this, the government mobilized the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. Their mandate was to clear the slums and rapidly construct massive blocks of high-rise apartments with modern sanitation and electricity. Public housing residency spiked from 9% in 1959 to 80% by the late 1980s. By allowing citizens to use retirement savings to buy these assets and enforcing racial quotas in every block,
the government gave everyone a financial stake in survival. The physical effort required to drain the swamps and build hundreds of thousands of concrete units had a secondary effect. It trained a vast, organized, and nationalized workforce. The modern city-state was systematically engineered, block by block, through calculated public policies that forced a fractured immigrant population into a unified society.
The result of that relentless domestic engineering is the transition from an underdeveloped colonial outpost to a hyper-modern metropolis. This architectural grandeur serves as a physical survival mechanism. The skyline and the reclaimed land are engineered to signal the city's permanence and relevance to the rest of the world. The national psyche remains defined by a consciousness of competition. To stay alive, the island must remain an indispensable node in the global economy. The city's trajectory, from a mythical beast in the jungle to a towering digital hub, was forged through deliberate, engineered resilience. For a nation without natural resources, survival remains a matter of collective will.